Hello and welcome to Unit 3 in our early Latin American history class. In this unit, we're going to look at the Long Conquest, or at least that's what Restall and Lane have called it. So just right off the bat, we have to think about why they refer to the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish and the Portuguese as the Long Conquest, rather than just the conquest. Another major theme to keep in mind as we study this unit is the notion that the conquest was never actually completed, at least not the way that the Spanish crown, the Portuguese crown, the Pope, or even the conquistadores themselves, or I should also add the Catholic missionaries like the Franciscans, the Jesuits, the Dominicans. The conquest was never completed in the ways that they had intended. And so as you read through the materials for this unit, think about what that actually means. Because what it, at least in one respect, and there are other ways to, or other directions to take this, but in one respect, that means that Native people were able to push back and negotiate the conquest to a far greater degree than scholars had recognized or given credit for even as much as 30 years ago. So the way that we've thought about the history of the conquest has changed much in the last few decades. Restall really focuses on that notion of who are the conquistadores, trying to show us that they're not exactly the knight in shining armor type heroes that they're often portrayed to be in popular media portrayals of the Spanish conquest. And also, something that he points out that is crucial is that many people of African descent were also among the conquistadores. So there were, again, people of African heritage who were not only slaves who acted as conquerors. There were also slaves who were forced into supporting the conquest due to the will or the whims of their masters. And so that's a group that typically has not really been associated with the conquest. We're also going to be introduced in a lot more detail during this unit to the Aztecs, or I should say the Aztec Empire. The Mexica people were at the head of the Aztec Empire. They were part, or I should say not even part of, but kind of in control of the Triple Alliance in the city of Tenochtitlan. And they were able to create a very expansive and far-ranging empire. So we'll make some connections back to some of the readings that we did in Unit 2. Also, the website on African slavery that is listed with the readings below, that will also help make a connection back to Unit 2 and help us continue to think about the place of people of African heritage during the long period of conquest in the Americas. Something else to think about is that the conquest, at least in its initial stages, that was that period from, as Restall and Lane delineate it, from the kind of mid-1400s when the Spanish and the Portuguese really began maritime exploration. First, the Portuguese around Africa, and then following Christopher Columbus, the Spanish across the Atlantic toward the Americas. Then, of course, after discovering that there was a Western Hemisphere, and from that perspective of the Europeans, it was a discovery. Of course, from the perspective of the natives, they knew they were there. There was no new discovery here. But from that perspective of the Europeans, then the question was, well, how do we administer over this area? What role do we want to play in it? So something crucial to keep in mind is that there were a couple of different models for that. The Spanish wanted to have a territorial empire, and the Portuguese, building on the models that they had already established in Africa, along the coasts, in India, and as far as China, they wanted more of a commercial empire. They were more interested in setting up trading posts along the coast and dealing with the people who already lived in the region. So Brazil is always the counterpoint to the Spanish Americas, but in so many ways, Brazil got a very different start because it was part of that Portuguese commercial empire rather than the model that the Spanish had of sending out these adelantados or conquistadores who would put up their own money, their own resources to try to conquer large empires in the name of Spain, but in order to gain titles of wealth, nobility, authority, and power. So Cortez is an excellent example of somebody looking for power and authority. He wasn't after simple plunder when we look at the conquest of Tenochtitlan. On the flip side of all of this, we have to keep in mind where native people were coming from. And I think the readings in Andrian will really do a good job of helping us to see the kinds of problems that they faced as they were confronted with the Spanish and Portuguese systems of colonialism. Some chose to become what scholars have called go-betweens or intermediaries by kind of incorporating themselves into the colonial structure, gaining positions of power, at least relative positions of power that were blessed by the Spaniards or the Portuguese among their own people, so that they would also then solidify their place among their own people as having authority. But then many of them use that position, not only to sell out and better their own place in the world, but also as a means of trying to protect their native lifeways, their culture, their beliefs. In the process, this messy, long conquest, there was a hybrid type of society that emerged. So that means that it was not completely Spanish. It wasn't just a recreation of the Iberian Peninsula throughout the Americas, as the Spanish had hoped it would be, but instead it was a constant negotiation between indigenous ways of doing things, indigenous ways of speaking. Words from native languages found their way into Spanish, and they've even found their way into English, since that time. And their ways of looking at the world, their ways of harvesting, planting, agriculture in general, and horticulture, those were things that the Spanish borrowed and used because they realized those things worked in the Americas. So look for all those cues of how this negotiation took place over the long conquest.